In Vedanta teachings, there's a threefold process, a threefold part to the spiritual process, to the sadhana. The first part is listening to the teachings. It's called Sravana in Sanskrit. Sravana means listening. So the first part of the teachings is to actually hear the teachings. And traditionally that would be done, you would hear them from the mouth of a guru. You would hear the words spoken or chanted. And then the second part is to think about the teachings, to ponder over them, to ask questions about the teachings, and to iron out any questions and any perceived inconsistencies you find, anything that doesn't make sense to you, to question it, to examine it, until you get the answers that satisfy you and you develop some kind of understanding and faith in the teaching. That second phase is called manana. And when you come to the end of manana, you realize in the Advaita Vedanta way of seeing things, in that prism, in that framework, you realize that I am the observer, I am the subject, and everything that I experience is the object, or the various objects. And really getting that can lead to a huge amount of freedom, because you feel free. You feel that there's an essence of you, there's a part of you which is untouched, regardless of what's happening. It doesn't matter what you go through, it doesn't matter how bad it gets, there's a part of you that's always untouched and okay. And that's the essence of you, the awareness that's just always present. And some people call that self-realization, because you've realized who you are. But hang on a sec, I said there were 3 or even 4 parts, didn't I? See, that's not the end of the story. And what I've seen a lot of around at the moment, especially in Vedanta teachings, is the Vedanta teachings kind of stop there. And a lot of the Vedanta teachers are just kind of talking about that, and that's it. And the next part in the spiritual process, the next part in the sadhana, is the actualization of those teachings. Sometimes it's translated as meditation. And in Sanskrit, the word is nididhyasana. Nididhyasana. And nididhyasana is having grasped the essence of the teaching, that I am that. I am that which never changes, which is untouched by all the objects that come and go, whose nature is being and presence. Sat, Chit. Sat means being or presence, and Chit means consciousness or knowingness. They often forget to talk about the Ananda. Ananda means bliss, because at the stage of manana, you'll feel the bliss of the self sometimes. But the happiness, the bliss will come and go, because you're still not pure. There's still doubt still arise. The self-knowledge is not stable. And fundamentally, the belief that you are the body-mind, the belief that you are the body-mind has still not fully disappeared. Because who is saying that I am not the body, I'm not the mind? It's the mind. The mind says, I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, I'm unchanging, I'm eternal, I'm timeless. Who's saying that? The mind's saying that. And there's still an identification there. And one of the best scriptures that really points this out in an explicit way is one of my favorite Advaita Vedanta texts. It's called Advaita Bodha Deepika, which means the lamp of non-dual realization or knowledge. And it's a book or a text that was highly recommended by Ramana Maharishi. So it's got a pretty good recommendation there, not just from me. And it goes through all of this. And the guru explains to the disciple why just knowing that I am that is not enough. But we have to embody it. We have to remove all the vasanas, all the addictive tendencies. That means that suffering continues. See, when you've reached a stage of manana, what happens, you get teachings like, if a teacher has reached that stage but hasn't purified themselves, they'll say things like, this is all there is. And suffering comes and suffering goes. And pain comes and pain goes. Whereas when the teacher has gone through nididhyasana, it's just, there's no suffering, there's no ego. This life is like an illusion, it's like a dream. Whereas when you're at the stage of manana, it's like, no, this is not an illusion. No, the ego doesn't end. The ego's still there. And suffering still happens. And you don't need to practice. But that's ignoring the purification aspects of the teaching, which is often what quite a lot of people don't really want to hear. You know, who wants to hear that it takes time? Isn't time meant to be an illusion? Aren't you meant to already be enlightened? Well, so this doesn't make sense, does it? Well, you don't have to believe me. You don't have to believe me. You can read it in the scripture. You can hear what people like Ramana say. But you don't have to believe them either. You don't have to believe the scriptures. You don't have to believe the sages. Because where's the true teacher? Teacher is within and without. Teacher's here. So when you understand these teachings, and if you're into non-duality and you've been following various non-dual teachings and reading about it and studying it and learning about it, and very importantly, looking at your own experience and comparing the teachings to your experience, seeing if they're true for yourself. If you do that in a fairly short amount of time, within maybe 1 or 2 or 3 years, many of you will get a good understanding of the teachings. Because that's the end of manana. You've heard the teachings, which is shravana. You've pondered on the teachings, you questioned the teachings, you compared it to your experience. You've reasoned it out, you've figured out the truth of what they're pointing to, finally. All the apparent inconsistencies, you started to figure out how they're more consistent now. And then you have a realization, and it's freeing. You might have a realization of no self. You might have a realization of no time. You might have a realization that nothing's here. Or that there's nothing to get. Or you might have a realization that the seeking is what the problem is. So if you're there, you've got to the manana aspect of the teaching. You've reasoned it out, and you've had a genuine insight and awakening, and you're free. And you're free. But the suffering still comes, right? And all this stuff still happens. And all I ask of you is not to believe me, because I could be wrong. Or what I'm saying might be right for me, but it might not be right for you. But what I ask is to open your heart, be honest with yourself. Often there'll be a realization of resistance and perhaps of a deep need for silence and stillness. Because it's in this third stage of the teaching, nididhyasana, that we start to really realize the value of silence and stillness. The value of it is there throughout. It's important in shravana when you're listening. You need a degree of stillness. You don't need to have a very still mind. You need a little bit of stillness for manana, because otherwise you can't think and you can't have any insight at all. But when it comes to nididhyasana, you need a huge amount of stillness and silence for the purification to come in. And it naturally happens if you allow it. You don't need to know these different stages of the teaching if you're open to your heart and you're open to life. But there tends to be a general progression that naturally unfolds. And here is when the devotional aspect can really kick in as well. If it hasn't already for you, if the devotional aspect of the teaching hasn't kicked in for you, if it's just, you don't really understand all this love, bliss stuff and this devotional, this deity worship type stuff, if that hasn't already kicked in for you, then at the nididhyasana stage, the purification stage, that can become very important, because our emotions are starting to purify. Our addictive tendencies are falling away, are loosening. The body-mind, apparent as it is, illusory though it is still purifying. And then at the end of it, there's no one here. There's just no one here. I said there are 3 or 4 stages. Some texts talk about the 4th stage as Samadhi. And Shankara talks about this in Vivekachudamani, his text called Vivekachudamani, which means the crest jewel of discrimination. And Advaita Vedanta, this text I recommended earlier, also talks about it. And Samadhi is this special experience. So it's still mithya, it's still part of mithya. This whole journey is a part of mithya. It's the illusion of a journey. It's the appearance of a spiritual journey. And almost everyone goes through it. Apparently. There's certain stages that just appear to happen. There's an apparent order to this apparent reality. And this satsang and this teaching is just a part of that. That intelligence manifesting. So Samadhi is a special experience where there's an experience of being awake and aware, but without any objects. And it's an intensely purifying and moving experience. And the teachings say this experience is necessary for full realization, for nididhyasana to complete itself. And not only is it necessary, but usually you have to stay in this samadhi for some time. Before the body-mind, apparent as it is purified, and self-realization occurs. And this is why there's so many different contradictory teachings. Because at the stage of manana, of reflection, you don't need to be that silent. You just need a bit of room just to see. Oh yeah, there seems to be an awareness here that is aware of everything. Or there's no one here. There's just no doer. There's no person. Everything's just happening spontaneously. And there may not be a duality of subject-object or awareness and objects of awareness, which in itself is a arbitrary duality, conceptual overlay. But when nididhyasana has occurred, when you've gone through that purification process, there's nothing left. You can't talk about it. You can't put it into words. You can't teach it. Everything is it. Nothing is it. So it's useful to know that, even if on an intellectual level. That deep silence, deep stillness can be a huge aspect of the latter part of the journey, if not throughout. And unless you understand that, you won't really understand how the different spiritual teachings across the world that spontaneously arise. Because as I said, this teaching just spontaneously arises in your heart if you're open to it. You won't understand how these teachings work. You'll be arguing. But let's say when the realization is full, there are no contradictions. Everything is well. Everything is fine. False gurus, true gurus, it's all good. There's only one teacher. There's only one teaching. And life teaches in its own wonderful, mysterious, sometimes painful way. You have written, I am in the third stage. This is, for people who've just joined, this is the stage of purification, of nididhyasana, in the Advaita Vedanta framework of looking at things. I have a lot of deep emotions, you write, Nikki. I have a lot of deep emotions coming up, very intense. Any tips for being with these? I don't have strong devotional tendencies because of the ritualistic ways of my culture that I lost faith in. Devoted to Ramana and the Guru's teachings. Namaste, namaskar. So, I have a lot of deep emotions coming up, very intense. Well, I don't know you personally, Nikki. I don't think we know each other, do we? The reason I say that is I do meet quite a lot of different people in satsang, so I don't think we've met. And it depends how deep and intense these emotions are. It depends how traumatic they are. And it depends how much they interfere with your day-to-day life. Because if they're deeply traumatic, they might well be, and they're interfering with your ability to function in day-to-day life, which for you they may be, or for maybe someone else listening, that might be happening, then I would really strongly encourage you to seek external support, either from a teacher, but preferably from a professional, or someone who's experienced, so a psychologist or a counselor or a therapist. And if you don't feel like doing that, just to talk to somebody, talk to a friend, someone you trust, and if you can't do that, then write things down. It'd be hugely beneficial. A grounding practice is also very useful, where we ground ourselves, where we meditate and we don't explore our emotions, where we go into presence awareness, or we become focused on this moment. We actually turn away from our emotions, because if our emotions are very intense, they can be very destabilizing. And if you are approaching intense emotions from an unstable place, that's a recipe for more destabilization and more suffering. Whereas if you are in a stable place where you're grounded and you're rooted and you're safe and you have perspective and calm and peace, from that place you can process even the most intense of emotions. But you've got to get there first. And that's where these practices can be useful. Devotional practices, using the voice is extremely powerful. Chanting. It could be singing a pop song that you like. But the devotional chants tend to be more powerful. The resonance goes deeper into us and has more of a purifying, healing effect. Guided meditations, visualizations can be very useful because they're powerful antidotes. So visualize whatever you're drawn to. Dancing, exercise, physical yoga practices, physical practices. These can be all very, very useful for dealing with intense emotions, which are physical sensations in the body. Emotions are physical sensations in the body, often linked to thoughts, but they're very often very physical as well. If you don't have strong devotional tendencies because of the ritualistic ways of your culture, perhaps, and I don't know if this worked for you, Nikki, perhaps you can use those rituals to aid you now. Perhaps you can use the teachings and the rituals you've learned that you've lost faith in to help you now in some way. I don't know what that means for you. It's just these words are coming to me, and maybe you can find some utility from what I've just said. Devotion to the Guru and the Guru's teachings, and devotion to your innermost self, yes, also very helpful. So in summary, external help if it's interfering with your life, if it's overwhelming you. Talk to a friend, write something down, seek a professional. And several of the people I've guided to different places in this realization, through seeing a psychologist or a counselor, they've been able to grow and deal with that stuff, and then the non-dual stuff slots in quite nicely. So seek external help if you need it. Then practices to do with the body, exercise, dancing, yoga, physical yoga. Then practice to do with the speech, chanting, singing. And then practice to do with the mind, visualization, meditation, grounding practices, breath work, turning away from the emotions, turning away from the thoughts, having a break from them. And then maybe returning to them from a place of strength. Or maybe you don't need to return to them. You be honest with yourself, you'll find your way.